Rennick.
Thank you, Acting Deputy Chair. And I too rise to speak against this motion because for too long there has been way too much fearmongering about the Great Barrier Reef, especially in regards to bleaching, which I'll touch on in a minute. But I want to refer to the Great Barrier Reef inquiry. It was the first inquiry I was ever participated in, and my first question in that inquiry was to the head of AIMS, the Australian Institute of Marine Science, and the question I asked was a very simple one. I said, do you have a centralised database of all the health KPIs relating to the Great Barrier Reef since the early 1980s, because that's when scientists started looking at the reef in detail, that demonstrates that the health of the reef is dying? And it took about 5 or 6 minutes of the usual bureaucratic obfuscation, and eventually we got out of her. All I wanted was a yes or no. We got out of the head of the Australian Institute of Marine Science a no. And here's the thing. The fact of the matter is that there's a lot of alarmism going on with the reef. There's a lot of money being wasted on scientific research that isn't being properly collated by the reef, and there is nothing, there is no data at all that demonstrates that the health of the reef is dying over the last 4 decades, dating back to the late 70s, early 1980s. Now, coral cover is being measured. It's only measured about every 5 years, and the latest update on coral cover last year showed that the coral cover on the reef was at record highs. Now, that's got nothing to do with climate change or anything like that, because one of the most toxic impacts on coral is actually fresh water, believe it or not. Anyone who's got an aquarium at home knows you either have a saltwater tank or a freshwater tank, and if it's a saltwater tank, you've got to keep it just right or the fish will die, as well as the coral. So the reason why the Great Barrier Reef is at record cover is because there's been very few cyclones, touch wood, up in North Queensland over the last decade. We've had a relatively stable last decade. The period just before that, we had Cyclone Yasi and another one, big cyclone that I can't think of at the moment, that really wiped out the reef. And so what you get with those— what was it called? Cyclone Larry. And what you get with those big cyclones are two things. You obviously get the cyclone itself, which rips up the reef, and then you get enormous dumps of fresh water. They go down those massive North Queensland rivers that we love so much, and that fresh water flows out onto the reef and then kills the coral even more. Okay, so that's got nothing to do with climate change or anything like that. That is just how the world works. But it demonstrates the lack of evidence and systemic record-keeping that is so typical of government bureaucracy. It's all fear-mongering and very little facts and figures. Now, later that afternoon, we had the Queensland Natural Resource Department come in, and I asked them another question. I asked them, what is your margin of error in regards to your measuring equipment when you actually measure concentrations of, I forget what it was, nitrogen and other potential contaminants on the reef? And their margin of error was between 60 and 90%. Okay? And not only that, they measured this water below, so where the farmland was, but they didn't have another gauge above the farmland, up in the high areas up on the Great Dividing Range, where you get a lot of dissolved nitrogen coming out, leaching out of the soil and all the leaf structure that's on our Great Dividing Range. And of course, I'm thinking here of Yungala and Chilumban and all of these beautiful areas up on our Great Dividing Range that's soon to get levelled in the name of climate change. We're going to destroy the environment to protect the environment. Only, anyone who makes sense of that, good luck with that. But I think it's worth pointing out the amount of misinformation that's going on based on no evidence whatsoever. But we really can't have a discussion about the misinformation on the Great Barrier Reef without talking about Professor Terry Hughes. This guy has been seeding such misinformation as it deserves to be called out. And I'm glad that Senator Wilson has given me an opportunity to speak about this, because I'd forgotten to raise it in the chamber, but this needs to be put on record, that Professor Hughes, Director of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies, told a Senate inquiry in 2014 about the rapid decline of the Great Barrier Reef, that coal dust had spread hundreds of kilometres from ports. It has now accumulated everywhere on the Great Barrier Reef, not just near dredging sites or near ports themselves, and it is exceeding toxic levels in near-shore locations. I think this new evidence is sufficient that recently issued permits to undertake dredging should be revoked. Now, these statements were based upon a study that was proven to be wrong. A guy by the name of, and let me just dig this up, by a very well-qualified CSIRO scientist, Dr Simon Apte, went back and examined the study that Professor Terry Hughes relied on, and he demonstrated that the coal dust concentrations on the Great Barrier Reef were exaggerated by 1,000%. By 1,000%. Now, this Dr Terry Hughes, he's considered a so-called expert, but yet has been one of the chief alarmists in spreading misinformation about the reef. Okay? And it has got to stop, because as a result of all of this alarmism, we've now got the Queensland government that has mandated that farmers who live in the Great Barrier Reef Basin have to implement a Great Barrier Reef plan in order to prove that their farms aren't allowing sediment to run off on the Great Barrier Reef. And it needs to be said, as I know my good friend Peter Ridd, Professor Peter Ridd has said many times, that the amount of sediments that comes out of the rivers is nothing compared to the amount of sediments that get washed up through the oceanic currents. But the farmers, now the Great Barrier Reef Basin is huge. It runs from Gympie and on the Mary River down south all the way out to Emerald. Now, the Emerald is a long way inland. It's a good 3-hour drive from Rockhampton, because the Belliano runs up. You know, if you're a farmer on the north side of Emerald there, your farm, the water will run into the Belliano, which then runs into the Herbert. So these farmers who are nowhere near the reef, and the idea that someone running a few cattle up near Emerald and somehow that's going to run all out into the reef is just absurd. These guys are expected to go and get a Great Barrier Reef plan that proves that their runoff isn't going to destroy the reef. Now, this plan costs them thousands of dollars, and they're liable to be fined up to $200,000 if they don't actually meet the requirements of the Great Barrier Reef plan. So this is just another example of all the green tape that is put onto our farmers. Now, I can tell you, I've spoken with many farmers, and I'll mention one in particular, Mr Raymond Yeo, who has now become Mayor of Ingham. I've got that right, Ingham? Hinchinbrook Shire Council. He's a farmer. He's a proud cane farmer. He's incredibly proud of his farm. He loves. I've had the pleasure of meeting him on a number of inquiries, and I always stop in and see him. We have lunch when I'm on my Wombat trip, because he is a top bloke. He is a top bloke, okay, and a great North Queenslander character. Sort of bloke that if I hadn't given up drinking when I became a senator, I would get on the terps with him. But I digress. He has, as he has said on many occasions, he does not want any runoff on his property because he wants to keep the soil on his property. He doesn't want erosion. They've got tanks there where they capture the runoff, and he says, as he says, they've got fish living in these ponds that they have for their sediment runoff, and they're very healthy and vibrant. The thing that concerns him is that some of these mangrove swamps now are so cluttered because of the World Heritage environment laws that stop them clearing up these mangroves, that the water can't get away in these floods, and it's causing severe flooding in his community. Now, these, yet again, all of this misinformation around the reef is having a massive impact on the hard-working farmers up in Queensland, and especially on the Great Barrier Reef, in the Great Barrier Reef basin. But I want to just go back to this bleaching that we hear about all the time. And yet again, another theme about record keeping. And as I'll say it again, and I'll say it 100 times while I'm still a senator, the record keeping, the quality assurance of our bureaucracy in Canberra is shocking. It is pathetic. Okay, so the way they record bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef is they have these trawlers. And these trawlers have these nets about 5 metres wide on each side, and they run up about a 200-metre area, so all up about a 2,000 square metre area. If they detect any bleaching whatsoever in that little run, then the whole area is deemed to be bleached. So even if you've got, say, 1 square metre out of the 2,000 square metres that might have a bit of coral bleaching, the way it is recorded is that the entire area is recorded as being bleached. Now, this is clearly overstating the amount of bleaching that occurs. It is, and the scientists know it, right? The scientists who, at AIMS or whatever, they know this, but they won't actually be honest about what's going on, because if they do that, then the funding will dry up. The funding will dry up. Over $1.2 billion has been given to people who go about trying to, whose interest is in claiming that the Great Barrier Reef is dying, because they then get more money to, supposedly save the reef. Now, it's interesting. I've got a friend who's a scientist, not on the Great Barrier Reef, but as he said, if he was to want to study the impacts of butterflies in Ecuador, he wouldn't be able to get any money on that. Right? It'd be very difficult to get funding if someone wanted to study the impact of butterflies, butterflies in Ecuador. But as he said, if he wanted to study the impact of climate change on butterflies in Ecuador, he'd have no problems in getting any money, right? Because that is how our scientific research is driven these days. It is driven by fear-mongering rather than facts, and that has got to stop. Now, just back to that original Great Barrier Reef inquiry, we had 2 days up in Brisbane, and then we rocked up, and it was my first Friday morning inquiry down here in Canberra, and none other than Professor Ian Chubb turned up. And he said in his opening statements that he wasn't going to have accountants telling his scientists what to do. And obviously he was referring to myself and my colleague Senator Susan McDonald, because we're both accountants. And he didn't seem to think that it was, we had any authority as senators, and he was having a jip at accountants to question scientists. Well, let me tell you something. All science is based on record keeping. Empirical science is just that. It is about going out and collecting evidence and proving that the observations or the theories that you may think are occurring are repeatable. And I was shocked because I had no idea who this Professor Ian Chubb was, and I certainly didn't expect him to lay into me in his opening statement. But it just goes to show the level of intimidation that these people try and put on senators and people that want to call out this fear-mongering. Well, he got the shock of his life when he found out that I wasn't going to be intimidated by any bureaucrat, and that he had an obligation, even though he was a former chief scientist, to actually tell the truth. And I'll just finish off on one other research paper that's been debunked over the years, and that was, I think it was the starfish or the thornfish. And there was a study done probably 10 or 15 years ago whereby they claimed that these particular type of species, I think it was a starfish, might have been a thornfish, was dying. Now, it proved out, and the sample size of the study was only 45 species, or sorry, 45, I'll say it was starfish. Now, it was subsequently proven, lionfish it was, sorry, I've got it, it was lionfish. It was subsequently proven that the photos that were taken were actually duplicates. So this scientist had actually gained her own study. She was a scientist from the Northern Hemisphere who came over here, got research money for research funding, and then basically put in a fraudulent claim about lionfish dying on the reef, using duplicate photos to increase the size of the sample to supposedly provide more evidence on what was proven to be a lie. So in conclusion, I say I reject this I reject the impact that this has on our farmers, and as Senator Canavan rightly points out, the impact it has on our tourism industry as we scare foreigners away who don't want to come here and destroy the reef. And I say we go back and we actually tell the truth about our environment for a change.
Authorised G. Rennick, LNP Chermside.